Today we begin a new sermon series and worship series titled Committed, and we're looking at various stories in the Bible as well as our stories that talk about and lift up what commitment is about. And today's story about Ruth is a really good place to start because you see, as I said before, Ruth's commitment is shown by her devotion and her dedication and her determination. That was Ruth, and so let's start by unpacking these three words: devoted, dedicated, and determined. Devoted. Webster's dictionary describes the meaning of devoted as meaning loving and loyal. And the devotion that Ruth exhibits leads me to imagine the backstory of her life. I'm thinking that perhaps in better years, her pre-widow years, Ruth, who married and most likely converted to the Jewish faith, had experienced the peace and security of living in a household whose faith had experienced the peace and security of being grounded in the steadfast and merciful love of the one God whose name was Yahweh. Ruth most likely grew up in households where there were multiple gods that were worshipped. These were gods who operated on whimsy and impulse, gods who randomly doled out punishment and reward with no seeming rhyme or reason. And so Ruth, in marrying into Naomi's household, learned to be grounded in the one God, Yahweh. A household that lived according to Yahweh's ways and rules. A household that knew what it meant to know God's steadfast and merciful love. So you see, Ruth's devotion was not just to Naomi. She was devoted to Naomi's people and Naomi's God. And her devotion to Naomi and Naomi's people, the Jews, and Naomi's God, the Yahweh of God's people, this devotion deepened over time and within the context of relationships that had shown themselves to be trustworthy and life-giving. Ruth's devotion became greater as she heard the amazing stories of faith that had shaped Naomi's people. Stories about how God had chosen a people, had rescued them from slavery. Stories about how God had provided for God's people in their times of troubles and brought them to a land that they could call their own. Perhaps Ruth had been deeply touched by the way that Naomi had accepted her into their household and taught her those codes that spelled out pretty clearly what it means to love God and to treat others kindly and fairly and with justice, especially those who were down and out, especially those like widows and orphans and the strangers among them. Ruth's devotion was sealed by her decision to dedicate the rest of her life to Naomi, Naomi's people, Naomi's God. Which brings us to the next word that characterizes Ruth: dedicated. According to the dictionary, to be dedicated is to commit to a goal or a way of life. And that's exactly what Ruth did. She committed to remain beside Naomi's side, come what may. She committed to a way of life practiced by Naomi's people, a way of life that trusted that somehow, even when life is running on empty, somehow God would be present in that emptiness. Somehow God would make a way. And Ruth committed to a God she had come to believe in as she placed herself within these stories of God's mighty acts of deliverance and provision and protection and presence. Yes, these were the stories that Naomi had taught her and taught her well. Stories that she had absorbed as her own. Stories that she would have to rely on herself in the bleakest of times, and there were bad times to come. And now that Naomi was in a very dark and bitter place, Ruth's faith in God is what gave her strength, Ruth's strength, to leave her own people, her own God, her own comfort zones in order to dedicate herself to Naomi's well-being, in order to dedicate herself to the God of Israel. This took a lot of determination. If you've ever tried to break away from a way of life you're familiar with, you know it takes a lot of determination and discipline. And if Ruth was anything, she was determined. Determined as in fully resolved, according to Merriam-Webster. There was nothing that Naomi could do or say that would cause Ruth to turn away from Naomi or Naomi's people or Naomi's God. Ruth's determination was one that compelled her to say to Naomi, I am not quitting on you. I'll never leave your side. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. Ruth was absolutely determined to remain at Naomi's side, with Naomi's people, trusting in Naomi's God. You know, it's no wonder that Ruth's words to Naomi are so often used in wedding ceremonies, because they are words of commitment and promise that reflect the kind of determined, stubborn, steadfast love that is absolutely needed to bind people together over all times and circumstances. Devoted to a relationship, dedicated to a purpose, determined to follow through. That was Ruth. The Bible contains many, many other stories of devotion and dedication and determination. Like the story Jesus told about a foreigner who devoted himself to a man lying for dead at the side of the road. This man who dedicated himself and his resources to this man's well-being. This man who was determined to do whatever it takes to save a man's life. Like stories in the Bible, the story of the friends of a paraplegic man who were determined to do whatever it takes to get him to Jesus so he could be healed. That's determination, that's devotion, that's dedication. Like the woman who, with a jar of expensive perfume, came into a room filled with men and poured her life and her story and all she had at Jesus' feet. Nothing would deter her. That's devotion. That's dedication. That's determination. And then there's the best story of all. It's the story of God who, in coming to the world in Christ Jesus, committed God's entire being to the world's healing and wholeness. This is the story of one who remained undeterred by all those things that tried to make him go away. Thomas, would you check the man that just went into the hallway, please? Thank you. This is the one who is fully devoted to this world and its people without regard for himself. The story that is the best one in the Bible is the story of the one Christ named Jesus, who was utterly dedicated to the purpose of bringing wholeness and healing to a world that, like Naomi, was running on empty. This is a story of one who is determined, absolutely determined, to confront those things and those systems and the powers that seek to destroy. Totally determined to confront those things that would kill and destroy the power of love in this world, even when it met death. Oh, it's a story, all right. It's a story of God's total commitment to us and this world. It's a God who says to us by way of an empty tomb, there is nothing that can stop me from loving. There is nothing that can stop me from working to bring restoration to this world. I'll never leave you. I'll never leave this world. I'm not quitting on you until all is well in life and this world. That's the story of determination. That's a story of devotion. That's a story of dedication. And that's the story that we, dear church, must tell. Why? Why should we tell it? Well, because it's true, because it's transforming, because it's life-giving and it's life-saving. We have got to tell this story. Why should we tell this story? Because for far too long, stories of God's judgment have dominated the landscape of faith. And because for far too long, people's faith has been shaped by fear of punishment and death by an angry God. Why should we tell this story of God's devotion and determination and dedication? Because for far too long, people have been damaged by hurtful actions and words spoken by folks who claim to have a corner on God's truth. And because too many people in this world feel like they are alone. Too many people in this world feel like they have nothing to hold on to that gives them hope. Too many people in this world feel as if everybody else has quit on them. We've got to tell this story, folks. We've got to tell the story that God does not quit on this world or on us. Because if we don't tell it, it may not be heard by someone who is running on empty. Someone just holding on by a thread. And the good news is that we have a plan, and a good one. We have a plan that will help us tell the story of God's commitment to this world, that will help us tell the story of God's love for this world and for us. And it's a plan that authentically reflects who we are as a congregation and how God is calling us to be. It's a plan that doesn't call on us to knock on doors with tracts, because face it, that's not who we are. We call this plan the FCC story. And how appropriate that our story is part of God's story of love. What I love about the FCC story is that it came out of a very careful and prayerful congregation-wide process. And I must tell you, in the more than 20 years that I have served as your pastor, I have never felt as excited and hopeful about our future as I do right now. Because what I love about this story is that it is bold. And it calls us to move out of our comfort zones and commit to new ways of sharing God's love. What I love about this FCC story is that it gives us concrete, tangible ways to serve and to welcome and to learn together. What I love about this FCC story is that it is about deepening those ties that bind us together with each other and with our world and with our God. But mostly, what I love about the FCC story, and if you haven't read it for a while, I remind you to get a copy of it. It's in the chapel gathering space, and let your memory be refreshed, because what I love about this story is that at its core, it's about empowering us, the church, to commit. To commit to commit to sharing the life-changing story of a God who is completely devoted to this world and its people, to commit to sharing the story of a God who is unabashedly dedicated to the world's well-being and utterly determined to do what it takes to bring wholeness, to never, ever quit on us. And that's a story worth telling. That's a story that we are telling and we will tell more fully as we move more into our story, the FCC story. You know, when we've got a story like that to tell, and an excellent plan by which to tell the story, why not tell it? Why not? Indeed.